You think you have power because you have a badge on your chest. You think that just flashing a red and green light, blowing a whistle, and giving orders will make the whole world stop. But tonight, on a quiet Redwood County road, the very body cam on a city police officer's chest will become the indictment that buries his career. The black SUV with government license plates rolled steadily down the right lane, the pale yellow streetlights reflecting off the paint, lightly scratched by years of service. The driver was Darnell Brooks, a sheriff's deputy with 16 years in the force, who had faced far more stressful situations and remained calm. He had just left the county courthouse after handing over files, his mind still preoccupied with a late dinner and tomorrow's shift, when a pair of red and green lights suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror. Darnell wasn't startled. He switched on his turn signal, slowed down, and pulled neatly to the side of the road, precisely as he had been trained. The engine shut off. The window was rolled down halfway. His hands rested neatly on the steering wheel, fingers spread wide so no one could tell he was hiding anything. This wasn't the reflex of someone afraid of the police, but the habit of someone who understood and respected the law. The Westvale PD patrol car pulled up behind them, the brakes screeching softly on the damp pavement. Officer Slade Riker stepped out, his collar rolled up, his gaze sweeping quickly over the SUV before settling on the black man behind the wheel. He didn't look at the government license plate, didn't notice the reflective county office lettering on the door, and didn't care that the man in front of him was wearing a law enforcement uniform. In Riker's mind, the story had already been written before he opened the patrol car door. He walked forward with a gait not of a routine traffic check, but of someone seeking something to prove he was right. Hands up. Don't move, Riker commanded, his voice sharp and abrupt. Darnell looked up, still in the same position, his voice low and clear. Officer, I am the deputy of Redwood County. This is a vehicle assigned to the agency. I'm on my way home. Not a hint of panic, not a hint of resistance. It's simply the truth being stated frankly. Riker paused for half a second, then gave a faint, almost blinding smile. Oh, really? He said, tilting his head to observe Darnell as if he were a storyteller. A black man driving a government car at this hour. Interesting story. His words hung in the cold night air, heavier than the sound of the siren. Darnell felt that moment acutely, the moment when a stop that could have ended in a few minutes had slipped in a different direction. He remained calm, knowing that every movement, every tone of his voice could be twisted into uncooperative. He didn't know that on Riker's chest, a body camera was silently recording everything, every glance, every word, every second of blind confidence of someone who thought the badge on his chest gave him the right to decide who belonged on this path and who didn't. And at that very moment, as Riker took another step toward the SUV, it wasn't just Darnell Brooks who was being stopped, but Riker's own career that began to come to a slow, irreversible halt. On a path he thought he was in control of, Darnell Brooks remained seated behind the wheel, back straight, his gaze fixed ahead instead of staring at the officer standing outside the window. He had learned early on that in moments like this, even a glance could be interpreted as provocation. 16 years in the profession had taught him more than the textbooks: when to speak, when to remain silent, and most importantly, when to defend himself with absolute composure. His voice was even, neither rising nor falling. Officer, my driver's license and badge are in my wallet. The wallet is in the back pocket. I'll take them. It was a standard, procedural statement, every word carefully chosen so no one could misinterpret it. Riker didn't answer immediately. He leaned closer, peering into the car, his flashlight sweeping across the dashboard, the passenger seat, and settling on the faded county agency logo on the door. But instead of letting that detail lead him to a logical conclusion, it only darkened his expression. No need to take anything, Riker growled. Get out of the car. Now. The command was harsh, leaving no room for dialogue. Darnell took a deep breath. He knew he was teetering on the edge between compliance and defiance. He opened the door and stepped out slowly, each movement clearly visible in the streetlights. When he stood upright, his uniform was fully visible, sheriff's insignia on his left chest, Brooks' name tag neatly aligned, his service belt unfastened as required upon leaving court. He raised both hands to his chest, palms facing outward, a posture so familiar it was almost painful. In the back of the patrol car, Officer Evans, Riker's younger teammate, watched in silence. Evans' gaze swept from the government license plates to Darnell's uniform and then stopped, a slight frown on his face. Something didn't quite fit the story Riker was telling himself. Evans took a half step forward, his voice hesitant. Riker, this car has county markings. Riker spun around, his sharp glance cutting short any attempt at further explanation. Shut up. I know what I'm doing. Those words not only extinguished Evans' hesitation but sent a clear message. This was not the time for independent thought. Darnell heard it all. He turned slightly toward Evans, not to plead, but to remind him. Officer, he said, his voice still calm. You can check the number on my service ID. Or call sheriff's office. This can be over very quickly. It was his last reasonable offer. Riker chuckled, a dry laugh echoing in the night. You talk too much, he replied, his hand resting on the butt of his gun as if by unconscious habit. Kneel. In that moment, Darnell understood that logic had no place. He knelt on the cold pavement, his knees touching the rough asphalt, his uniform rubbing against the dirt. Not because he was weak, but because he understood that the price of proving himself right by force at this moment would be his life. When his knees touched the ground, something in Riker's eyes lit up, as if he had just won. A small victory. I'll ask you again, Riker said, leaning closer. Where did you get this car? Darnell lifted his head, looking straight ahead, not into the prejudiced face. This car was assigned to the Redwood County Agency, he replied slowly. And everything you're doing right now is being recorded. Evans swallowed hard. He looked at the body cam on Riker's chest, the tiny red light still flashing steadily, and for the first time, a distinct feeling of unease arose within him. Some stops don't end with a ticket, but with consequences. Riker didn't answer immediately. He straightened up, stepping back half a pace as if considering something, but that hesitation lasted only a breath. Then his hand grabbed Darnell's wrist, pulling it forcefully behind his back. The sound of metal clicking shut echoed dryly in the quiet night. The handcuffs locked tightly, cold and sharp, constricting his flesh like an exclamation point for Riker's decision. Darnell didn't resist. He gritted his teeth, remaining silent, knowing that one wrong move could turn him from victim to object of opposition on the report. Stay still, Riker growled, his grip on the handcuffs tightening as if to assert his authority. Behind him, Evans took a slight breath, as if wanting to say something but then stopping. His gaze was fixed on the SUV, on the reflective lettering of the agency gleaming under the lights. Riker, he's in uniform, Evans said, his voice low but clear. Riker didn't turn. Uniforms can be bought online, he replied, his voice full of contempt. Don't be naive. Darnell heard him, but he didn't turn. He knew arguing now would only challenge the person in power. Instead, he spoke slowly, each word carefully. Chosen. Officer, I'm cooperating. I ask you to call your supervisor. I will call my supervisor as well. This is the safest way for everyone. Riker chuckled, a short, sharp laugh. You asked? He said, pushing Darnell toward the patrol car. Darnell's shoulder slammed against the cold metal of the vehicle, a sharp pain shooting up his arm. Listen carefully, Riker whispered close to his ear, his voice laced with the smell of cold coffee and irritation. Tonight, I am the law. That statement echoed not only in Darnell's ears, but also through the recording body camera. A stark confession Riker didn't even realize. A civilian car slowed down in the distance. Its bright red brake lights reflected off the road. Darnell caught a glimpse of a phone screen held up. Through the car's window, he knew he was no longer invisible. Someone's filming, he said softly, not as a threat, but as a matter of course. Riker spun around, his eyes glaring angrily at the car. Go away, he yelled. Don't get in the way of the police. The car sped away, but Darnell knew the footage might have been recorded. Riker bent down, snatched the wallet from Darnell's back pocket, and tossed it onto the hood. The wallet burst open, papers scattering onto the pavement. Under the dim yellow light, a card stood out clearly, its lettering sharp, Redwood County Sheriff's Office. Evans saw it, his eyes widening. Riker, he stammered. Riker picked up the card, turning it over and over as if examining a cheap item. He looked at Darnell, then back at the card, a smirk playing on his lips. Fake, Riker said decisively. He let go, dropping the card to the pavement, then unconsciously stepped on it, pressing down hard. The hard plastic made a soft crackling sound, but in Darnell's head, it echoed like an explosion. Darnell closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them. His voice lowered, no longer persuasive, but accusatory. "You've just tampered with your ID," he said. "Everything you do right now is being recorded." Riker didn't reply. He just smiled, the smile of someone who believed they had just intimidated someone. But right behind him, Evans stood motionless, looking at the ID card at Riker's feet and the flashing red light on the body cam, realizing for the first time that this was no longer a tense stop. This was the moment when things had crossed the line, and neither of them could pretend to turn back anymore. Riker bent down, picked up the official ID badge from the pavement, and brushed it off as if he'd just picked up a piece of trash. He held the badge up to the body cam lens, deliberately slowing it down so the image was clear. "See," Riker said, his voice half mocking, half satisfied. "It looks so real." Then he glanced at Darnell, his eyes full of defiance. "But let me tell you, I've seen this kind of thing many times before." Darnell stood still, his wrists cuffed behind his back, feeling the blood pounding in his aching wrists. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He only said one sentence, slowly and clearly enough for the camera to capture. "Officer, you're breaking the law, and you're recording it yourself." Riker laughed louder, his laughter echoing in the deserted night, sounding eerily empty. "Law," he said, his voice drawn out and contemptuous. "You don't belong here. Understand? You don't belong here." The words fell like a rock, not only on Darnell but also on the surrounding air. Evans, standing behind him, felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at the badge, at the uniform, then at Riker. Nothing made sense anymore. "Riker," Evans whispered, almost pleading, "the dispatch just said the license plate is government registered." Riker spun around. "I don't need to hear the dispatch," he snapped. "Do you see what I'm doing? I'm protecting this area." Then he turned back to Darnell, shoving him against the car again. "Stay right there." Darnell took a deep breath, trying to regain his balance. He knew every shove, every word now was building up into a thick file that Riker didn't seem to realize. "Officer," Darnell said, his voice remarkably calm, "I'm asking you to call your supervisor. I'm also asking you to note that I'm not resisting." Riker didn't answer. He turned his back and switched on the radio. "Dispatch, Unit 12, Riker said, his voice trying to sound normal but with a hint of irritation. "I'm holding a suspect impersonating law enforcement, requesting further investigation." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then the dispatch voice came through, slower than usual. "Unit 12, confirming the license plate. This plate belongs to Redwood County, registered in the federal system." Evans looked at Riker, his eyes wide. He expected this moment to be the end. But Riker just gritted his teeth and abruptly switched off the microphone. "I don't care," he muttered. "The car might be stolen." Darnell closed his eyes for a brief moment, not out of despair, but because he understood perfectly what was going on in the other man's head. When someone has staked their ego on a wrong decision, they'll do anything to avoid admitting that mistake. "Officer," Darnell continued, his voice low and firm, "I'm handcuffed, I'm cooperating, and you're searching a government vehicle without a basis. It's all being recorded." Riker leaned in, his face close to Darnell's. "You like talking about cameras, don't you?" he murmured, his voice menacing. "Cameras won't save you." In the distance, a house door opened. A woman stood on the porch, observing the scene under the streetlights, then slowly raised her phone. Darnell saw the screen flash. Riker saw it too. He turned, raising his hand and shouting, "Go inside. Don't film." But the woman didn't lower her phone immediately. She stood there for a few more seconds, long enough to capture the image of a black man in sheriff's uniform handcuffed next to a government-plated SUV under the tense, watchful eyes of city police. Evans swallowed. He felt his throat dry. "Riker, this isn't right," he said, his voice trembling. Riker didn't respond. He just stood there, his hand still clutching the scratched ID badge, his eyes darkening. In his mind, it wasn't about right or wrong anymore, but about who would back down first. And while Riker was trying to maintain the upper hand, he didn't realize that his words and actions, recorded perfectly on body cameras and on the phones of those around him, were silently building an impenetrable wall of evidence, brick by brick, right in the middle of the path he thought he controlled. Riker took a deep breath, then exhaled, forcefully through his nose as if making a final decision. He turned toward the SUV, yanking the driver's door handle. The door swung open. "I'm going to inspect this vehicle," Riker said loudly. Not as a question, but as a declaration, his voice deliberately loud enough for the body cameras and those around him to hear. "If you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to worry about." Darnell stood still, his wrists cuffed behind his back, staring straight ahead. "Officer," he said, each word heavy and clear, "you have no legal basis to search this vehicle. This is a government vehicle. I do not consent to your inspection." That remark was like adding fuel to the fire. Riker spun around, his eyes cold. "You disagree?" he mimicked, then laughed. "You're handcuffed. You can't decide anything." He leaned into the car, his flashlight sweeping across the dashboard, glove compartment, and passenger seat. Evans stood nearby, his hands clenched, his eyes fixed on Riker's every move. He clearly saw the sealed envelopes, the neatly stacked papers, the specialized walkie-talkie in the tray. Everything pointed to one thing. This wasn't a stolen car. Not the car of an imposter. Riker opened the trunk. The lid snapped open, the metallic clang echoing in the night. He rummaged through it, pulling out a bag of equipment. "What's this?" Riker asked, his voice full of suspicion. "Incrimination sealing equipment," Darnell replied immediately, without hesitation. "For sheriff's office work." Riker shook his head, scoffing. "Sounds professional," he said, then turned to Evans. "See? Full gear. Very professional." Evans opened his mouth to say something, then closed it tightly. He knew any words at this moment could enrage Riker even more. Another car slowed down in the distance. This time it wasn't just one person filming. Two, then three phones were raised. The screen lights flickered in the darkness. Riker saw it, and his frustration turned into something akin to panic. "Get on with it," Riker yelled, waving his hands. "This is work territory." But the more he yelled, the more he looked like someone trying to cover up rather than control the situation. Darnell felt the weight of the moment. He wasn't speaking to Riker anymore. He was speaking to the camera, to the people filming, to anyone who would. "Later watch this video." "I was handcuffed," he said, his voice low but clear. "I didn't resist. I refused to cooperate with the search. I requested that this officer's supervisor be present." Those words weren't meant to persuade, but to record. Riker turned, leaning close to Darnell's face. "You like to act, huh?" he whispered. "Keep acting. Let's see how far you can go." Evans couldn't take it anymore. He pulled out the radio, his hands trembling, and turned away half a step so Riker wouldn't see him clearly. "Dispatch," Evans said quickly, his voice urgent. "Request a sergeant to the scene. We need a supervisor." Riker heard the radio and spun around. "What the hell are you doing?" he roared. Evans froze, his face pale. I think we need a supervisor," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Riker stared at Evans for a few seconds, his eyes practically devouring him. But then Riker turned away, waving his hand angrily. "Suit yourself," he snapped. "Let's see who's right and who's wrong." In that moment, amidst the flashing red and green lights, the slowing traffic, and the watchful eyes from afar, Darnell understood that things had entered a different phase. This was no longer the story of an individual targeted during a traffic stop. This had become a scene where every word, every gesture was being recorded. And when Evans called his supervisor, a door had opened, a door that, once opened, could not be closed by anyone's arrogance or ego. The screeching of tires echoed from behind, then flashing red and green lights cut through the already tense night. Another patrol car pulled up a few meters from the scene. The door opened, and Sergeant Mason of Westvale PD stepped out. He had been in the force for over 20 years, long enough to tell at a glance that something was wrong. Mason's eyes scanned the scene. A handcuffed black man standing on the side of the road, wearing a sheriff's uniform. An SUV with government license plates. Several civilians standing at a distance with their phones raised. And Riker, standing upright, but with an awkwardly tense expression. In just a few seconds, Mason understood this was no ordinary traffic stop. "What's going on here?" Mason asked, his voice low but firm. Riker immediately spoke up, quickly and urgently, as if he had prepared a report in his head. Sarge, a suspicious individual, suspected of impersonating law enforcement, driving what appears to be a stolen vehicle. I'm conducting an investigation. Mason didn't answer immediately. He turned to Darnell. Your name? Deputy Darnell Brooks, Redwood County Sheriff's Office, Darnell replied, his voice calm despite the stinging pain in his wrists from the handcuffs. Number 2147. I'm cooperating and have requested my supervisor. Mason nodded slightly, then turned to Evans. Is the body cam on? Evans swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, it's been on since the beginning. That answer made Mason let out a small sigh, a sigh of both relief and anxiety. He looked back at Riker, his gaze sharper. Unclip him, Mason said. The words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of his rank. Riker froze for a brief moment. Sarge, he's resisting, Riker began, but Mason interrupted him. I said unclip him. Now. Riker gritted his teeth, his hand trembling slightly as he inserted the key into the handcuffs. The sound of metal clicking open echoed in the silence. Darnell reached out, gently rubbing his reddened wrist, but said nothing more. Mason looked at the mark, his eyes darkening. Was anyone injured? Mason asked. No, Darnell replied. But my ID card was tampered with, and my car was searched without justification. Mason turned to look at the scratched ID card in Riker's hand. He took it, glanced at it, then looked up. Do you know what this is? Mason asked. Riker answered curtly, a potentially fake card. Mason was silent for a few seconds, then spoke slowly. Did you verify it? Riker didn't answer immediately. Evans looked down at the ground. Darnell stood straight, his voice clear. I suggested calling sheriff's office from the beginning. Mason turned to Riker, his eyes no longer concealing his disappointment. You should have stopped there, Mason said. You should have verified it. Riker opened his mouth to argue, but Mason raised his hand to stop him. In the distance, a civilian called out, I've filmed it all. Mason turned his head, then nodded slightly. I understand, he said. Thanks. He turned back to Darnell. Deputy Brooks, I apologize for what happened. I'll make sure you get copies of the body cam and dash cam footage from all the units involved. Then Mason turned to Riker, his voice low. And you, Riker, hand over your guns and badges. Right here. The words fell heavily, like an irreversible milestone. Riker was stunned. Sarge, you can't. Mason looked him straight in the eye. I can. And I'm doing it. Riker slowly removed the gun from his belt, placed it in Mason's hand, then removed his badge, the metal gleaming under the streetlights before disappearing from his chest. Evans stood beside him, his heart pounding, realizing he was witnessing a rare moment. A moment when power changed hands right in the middle of the road. And while Riker stood there, empty and bewildered, Darnell Brooks looked up at the night sky, took a deep breath, and understood that this stop was officially over. But the story was only just beginning. The flashing red and green lights continued steadily, but the atmosphere had completely changed. If just minutes before the scene resembled a tense confrontation between a police officer and a suspect, now it looked like a sealed-off area awaiting investigation. Sergeant Mason stood to one side, radio pressed to his ear, speaking briefly but decisively. Send me the duty officer, and inform the night shift commander. We have a serious incident. Riker stood a few steps away, his hands hanging loosely, his eyes blank as he stared at the SUV he had just searched. For the first time that night, he wasn't giving orders. Just minutes later, 2 more cars appeared, bearing the logo of the Redwood County Sheriff's Office. They didn't rush forward, nor did they blare their sirens, but instead entered the scene with the cool composure of those who knew they were in control. The doors opened, and Lieutenant Harris, the sheriff's office shift commander, stepped out. He didn't ask any questions. His gaze stopped at Darnell, then at the red mark on his wrist, and finally at the SUV and the scratched police badge in Mason's hand. Darnell? Harris called, his voice low but authoritative. Are you all right? Darnell nodded. I'm all right, Lieutenant, but I want a full report of what happened. Harris turned to Mason, holding out his hand. Show me the body cam. Mason nodded, handing back the memory card he had just removed, carefully, as if handing over a precious piece of evidence. I suspended Officer Riker on the spot. Mason said, all the cameras are working. Harris nodded slightly, then turned to look at Riker. His gaze wasn't angry, but rather one that made it clear any excuses were futile. "Do you know what you just did?" Harris asked. Riker opened his mouth, but no sound came out. In the distance, Evans stood frozen, but then Harris called his name. "Officer Evans." Evans jumped. "Yes?" "You stay at the scene. You'll write a detailed report. Everything you see, everything you hear. No speculation, just the facts." Evans swallowed hard and nodded. In that moment, he understood that his choice tonight, calling his supervisor, not turning away, had put him on a different path than Riker. Harris turned back to Darnell. "Your vehicle isn't going anywhere until it's been properly inspected and sealed," he said. "We'll escort you back to the unit. And I promise you, this won't be buried." Darnell looked at Harris, his eyes weary but resolute. "I don't need a promise, Lieutenant," he said. "I just need everything recorded exactly as it happened." Harris nodded. "It's already been recorded." One of the residents stepped closer, his phone still held aloft. "I have the video," he said. Harris turned, calmly. "Thank you. That video could be very important. If necessary, we'll contact you." The man nodded, lowering his phone for the first time. As Darnell was escorted to the sheriff's office, he turned to look back at the road he had just traveled. There, just minutes before, he had knelt, handcuffed and under suspicion in his uniform. Now, Riker stood there, without badge, without a gun, his eyes vacant under the streetlights. Darnell said nothing to him, not out of forgiveness, but because he understood that from this moment on, everything would no longer be in his hands. It had shifted to the files, to the cameras, to the questions no one could avoid. And as the convoy began to leave the scene, a quiet truth formed. The stop was over, but a larger, deeper, and more uncompromising investigation had officially begun. The night didn't end when the cars left the scene. It just moved. In the small conference room of the Redwood County Sheriff's Office, a cold white fluorescent light shone down on a long table where Darnell Brooks sat upright, hands clasped in front of him, across from Lieutenant Harris and an internal investigator. No more sirens, no more flashing lights, only the heavy silence of a space where every word became documentation. Harris pressed a button on his laptop. "We're going to go back to the beginning," he said. The screen lit up, and Riker's bodycam footage began playing. Riker's voice echoed clearly in the enclosed room. "Hands up. Don't move." Then the next sentence, sharp and cold. "Where did you steal this car?" Harris said nothing. He let the video tell its own story. When it reached the part where Riker smirked and said, "You don't belong here," the internal investigator quietly took notes, his pen pausing longer than usual. Darnell looked at the screen, not with anger, but with a strange feeling, as if watching another version of himself, in a situation he hadn't chosen. The video continued. The handcuffs, the wallet being snatched, the ID badge falling to the ground and being stepped on. In the meeting room, no one spoke a word. Only the sound of Riker's shoes in the video, the hard plastic scraping against the pavement, and Evan's voice in the background, fading. "Riker, that looks like a real badge." Harris stopped the video at that moment. He turned to Darnell. "Did you say anything in the video that was defiant or threatening?" Darnell shook his head. "No, Lieutenant. I was just asking for verification and supervision." Harris nodded slightly, as if he already knew the answer. Elsewhere, at Westvale PD headquarters, the atmosphere was a stark contrast. Riker sat alone in an empty interview room. No badge on his chest, no gun at his side. A glass of water sat before him, long since cold. Through the one-way glass, the chief of Westvale PD and an internal affairs officer watched. They were also watching the body cam. When Riker said, "Tonight I am the law," the chief subtly closed his eyes. "Turn it off," he said, his voice weary. He turned to the investigator. "How many of his vehicle stops have we had in the last 6 months?" The investigator flipped through the files. "More than average. And the search rate for people of color is unusually high." The chief didn't respond immediately. He understood that this matter went far beyond a single individual. Back in the sheriff's office, Harris closed his laptop. "Darnell," he said, his voice slow and steady, "this will be escalated. It's not just a complaint. We're going to request an independent investigation." Darnell nodded. "I don't want anyone dealt with," he said. "I want the truth to be seen." Harris looked at him, his gaze a mixture of respect and heaviness. Your composure tonight is what has allowed that truth to exist, he replied. Meanwhile, Evans sat at another desk, writing his report. His hand trembled slightly as he typed, but he didn't stop. He wrote about the license plates, the uniforms, the moment his ID badge fell to the ground. He knew that every word he typed was clearly positioning him on a different side. And for the first time since joining the force, he understood that doing the right thing wasn't always safe. But doing something wrong would certainly come at a price. As the clock struck dawn, the first files were stamped. Body cams were backed up. Dash cams were sealed. Videos from citizens were collected. On either side of the city, no one slept soundly. For everyone understood that from this moment on, the story would no longer be told through justification, but through images, sounds, and questions that were not easily answered. And as Darnell left headquarters, stepping out into the fading night sky, he knew that the car stop had opened up an irreversible chapter. A truth had been recorded, and a system now forced to confront itself. The following morning, before the city had fully woken up, the story had already begun to spread beyond the walls of the two police stations. Not through rumors, but through short video clips, cropped from body cameras and citizens' phones, appearing simultaneously on social media. One headline went viral. Deputy pulled over in uniform. City police ignore government sign. In the clip, Riker's voice was clearly audible, and the image of Darnell standing handcuffed beside the county agency's SUV made viewers pause, even if only for a second. At Westvale PD, Chief Harrison arrived at his office very early. He hadn't even sat down when the phone rang. This time it wasn't from a subordinate, but from the mayor's office. "We have a problem," the voice on the other end said bluntly. "The press is asking questions, and they're not asking politely." Harrison glanced out the window and saw a news van parked across the street. He understood this was no longer an internal matter that could be resolved in a closed-door meeting. He called internal affairs into the office. "I want the entire Riker file," he said. "Every stop, every complaint, even those that were previously dismissed." On the other side, at the Redwood County Sheriff's Office, Darnell sat in his office, a cup of cold coffee before him. Before he could take a sip, his phone vibrated. Messages from colleagues, friends, people he had supported in the field. Some inquired. Some offered words of support. Some simply sent a short message. "I've seen the video." Darnell turned off the screen and leaned back in his chair. He didn't feel victorious. He only felt a profound weariness, the kind of weariness of someone who knows they've just become the center of a story much bigger than themselves. That afternoon, Westvale PD released a short statement. The wording was carefully chosen, but it wasn't enough to appease public opinion. "Officer Slade Riker has been suspended pending an investigation," the statement read. "We are committed to full cooperation." Online, the response came immediately. People weren't asking, "Is there an investigation?" but "Where is the investigation going?" Other videos were unearthed. Old stories were retold, and Riker's name began to be associated with a long list of unsettling questions. Evans read the announcement on his phone while sitting in the break room. He saw Riker's name, saw the word suspended, but felt no relief. He knew suspension was just the beginning. A few minutes later, an email from Internal Affairs appeared in his inbox, requesting his presence for formal testimony. Evans closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He remembered the moment on the roadside, when he hesitated, then decided to call his supervisor. If he had remained silent that night, perhaps everything would have been over. But now, he understood that this silence would haunt him longer than any investigation. By afternoon, the story had spread beyond the city limits. A regional news agency broadcast its first report, replaying the original bodycam footage. The presenter offered little commentary. They let the images and sound speak for themselves. "Where did you steal this car? You don't belong here. Tonight, I am the law." Each statement blurred the line between justification and truth. Legal experts appeared, analyzing civil rights, the stopping procedure, and emphasizing one thing. The uniform and government license plates should have ended the stop within seconds. Later that day, an official letter arrived at Westvale PD from the Regional Federal Prosecutor's Office. Not an accusation, but a notice of review. A review of civil rights violations under the guise of law. Harrison took the letter, read it over and over, then set it down on the table. He knew from this moment on, Things were spiraling out of his control. This wasn't just about keeping or losing an officer. This was about the reputation of an entire agency, and possibly an entire system, being put on the line. As night fell once again, Darnell left the office later than usual. He walked out to the parking lot, where his personal car sat silently. He stood there for a moment, watching the city lights reflect on the car's windshield. Last night, he stood on the side of the road, handcuffed, under suspicion. Tonight, he stood free, but carrying a different burden. He knew that what happened could not be erased, nor should it be erased, because somewhere out there were many people without uniforms, without badges, without supervisors to call upon. And if this story forced the system to stop and look itself in the eye, then every glance, every word, and every video from last night had done its part. On the third day after the car stop, the atmosphere in the city was as heavy as the calm before a storm. Outside the Westvale PD headquarters, television vans lined up from early morning, their antennas erected like giant question marks. Inside, the corridors, usually filled with hurried footsteps, were eerily silent. Chief Harrison convened an emergency meeting with the command staff. On the table lay a thick stack of printed documents, statistics on car stops by ethnicity, search rates, and the number of complaints closed due to lack of evidence. No one spoke loudly. No one dared to say much, because numbers don't lie, and they were speaking very loudly. At the Redwood County Sheriff's Office, Darnell was invited to a meeting with the county's legal counsel, not to polish his image, but to prepare for the inevitable. The lawyer spoke slowly, carefully choosing his words. You have the right to file a civil rights petition. You also have the right to do nothing. But because you're in the legal profession, every choice you make will be scrutinized. Darnell nodded. He wasn't there for revenge. He was there to have things called by their proper names. I want everything based on evidence, he said. No emotion, no ambiguity. Meanwhile, Evan sat in the internal affairs interrogation room. The room was small, the lights cold and white, and a tape recorder sat in the middle of the table. The investigator asked him to recount everything from the beginning, without omitting a detail. Evans described the license plate, the insignia, and the moment he said, "The car has county markings," and was dismissed. When asked why he called his supervisor, Evans replied after a brief pause, "Because things didn't make sense anymore." That statement was recorded, without embellishment or justification. It stood there as a landmark. At noon, the county prosecutor's office announced it had forwarded the case to the federal level for consideration of potential civil rights violations. News spread quickly. Analyses began to appear, no longer focusing on an individual, but on a pattern. When power goes unchecked, when prejudice is masked by procedure, when cameras become the ultimate witness. Former commanders went on air, not to defend, but to say something rarely said aloud before. Body cams don't destroy police. They destroy the indefensible. That afternoon, Chief Harrison stood before the press conference. He didn't read a smooth statement. He looked directly into the cameras. What we see in the video is unacceptable, he said. The investigation will be thorough. And whatever the outcome, we will change the way we work. The statement didn't immediately calm public opinion, but it set a line. Outside, reporters pressed him with questions about command responsibility, about training, about past incidents. Harrison answered without hesitation, and for the first time in years, he didn't use the word isolated. As the sun set, an internal memo was sent throughout Westvale PD. All vehicle stops with inspections over the past 12 months would be reviewed. Supervisors responsible for signing off on them would have to provide explanations. The government vehicle verification process was updated immediately, with immediate effect. Those dry words carried a weight everyone in the industry understood. There was no room for "I thought" or "I believe." Darnell left the law office as darkness fell. He stood on the steps, listening to the city slow down. His phone vibrated, a short message from a stranger. "Thank you for staying calm." Darnell read it, then put it away. He knew this story wasn't over. It was moving from the crime scene to the case file, from video to decision, from the individual to the system. And at each step, the truth would have to stand alone, without anyone's support. It would just have to be seen straight on. 2 weeks later, as the media frenzy began to subside, The real movements were quietly and heavily underway within the system. One Monday morning, Westvale PD received an official document from the federal prosecutor's office. It was no longer a matter of reviewing or gathering information. The document used clear legal language, opening an investigation into civil rights violations under the guise of law. When the fax was placed on Chief Harrison's desk, he sat silently for a long time, his hand resting on the edge of the table, understanding that from this moment on, no internal decision would suffice to close the case. That same day, Slade Riker was summoned to Internal Affairs Headquarters. Without his uniform or patrol car, he entered through the civilian door, passing through the metal detector like everyone else. In the interview room, Riker was faced with two investigators and a small recording device. They didn't speak loudly. They didn't need to. They simply turned on the body camera and let Riker's voice echo in the enclosed room. "Tonight, I am the law." The words rang out, undistorted, unedited. Riker bowed his head, his hands clasped together, sweat beading on his temples. For the first time, he realized he no longer controlled the narrative told through his own voice. Across the city, Evans sat before a federal investigator. There was no intimidation, just short, direct questions. "Did you see the ID badge?" "Yes." "Did you tell a colleague?" "Yes." "Why did you decide to call your supervisor?" Evans answered honestly, without embellishment or overprotection. When the session ended, the investigator nodded. "You did something many people wouldn't," he said. Evans walked out, feeling a little lighter, but also understanding that his path in the profession would never be the same. A week later, Riker received his official dismissal notice. The brief, emotionless document listed the violations: improper vehicle stops, unauthorized searches, inappropriate conduct, and serious damage to the agency's reputation. There was no mention of emotion, motive, or good intentions. Only the actions and their consequences. Riker read the letter over and over, then placed it on the empty kitchen counter in his rented apartment. His phone remained silent. No calls from colleagues. No message from superiors. The so-called green wall had quietly retreated, leaving him alone with the files and videos. Meanwhile, at the Redwood County Sheriff's Office, Darnell was invited to a closed-door meeting with county leaders and legal representatives. They didn't ask him if he wanted to push the case. They asked him how he wanted things recorded. Darnell thought for a moment and said, "I want it recorded exactly as it happened. No downplaying, no exaggeration." He knew he could become the face of a campaign, but he didn't want that. He wanted the case to stand on solid evidence, so that anyone reviewing it could draw their own conclusions. When news of Riker's dismissal broke, the reaction in the community wasn't as boisterous as many had expected. No celebration, no glee, just subdued conversations. On social media, one comment was shared repeatedly: "Nobody's happy to see someone lose their job," but many breathe a sigh of relief that the system has finally said, "Stop it." Darnell read that comment late one evening. He nodded, as if answering a question he had been asking himself for days. And while records continued to be reviewed, investigations quietly proceeded. One thing became clear to all involved. The bodycam footage from a brief stop had accomplished what dozens of previous internal meetings had failed to do. It forced the system to slow down, to confront the issue, and to choose, either to fix itself or to let the truth fix it. A month later, when the headlines had faded and the clips were no longer plastered all over the homepage, the true consequences of that night became clear. The Department of Justice officially announced an investigation into the model and practices of Westvale PD, not because of a car stop, but because of what that stop revealed. Investigators began sifting through hundreds of old files, cases previously closed due to lack of evidence, and complaints dismissed as misunderstandings. This time, there was no rush to close the case. Camera footage, data, and testimony were laid side by side, cold and emotionless, but precise. Westvale PD was forced to announce a reform plan. Bias training became mandatory. Stopping procedures were rewritten. Supervisors were held directly accountable for ignoring clear signs. Body cams were no longer a support tool, but a legal obligation. For many officers, this was unsettling. For others, it brought a sense of relief. Because for the first time, the line between power and responsibility was redrawn with indelible ink. Evans transferred to a different unit. Before leaving, he met Darnell in the sheriff's office parking lot. There was no ceremony, no ceremonial handshake. Evans simply said, "I've thought a lot about that night." Darnell nodded. "It's not what you think that matters," he replied. "It's what you did that matters." Evans bowed his head, as if carrying that statement with him into another phase of his career. As for Riker, his story didn't end with the dismissal letter. Federal charges continued to advance, slowly but surely. His lawyer advised him to remain silent. Old friends stopped calling. What had once been shielded by the badge now ceased to exist. There was no schadenfreude around him, only the emptiness of someone who, for the first time, understood that power protects no one from consequences once the truth has been revealed. As for Darnell, life quietly returned to its usual rhythm. He continued his work, continued wearing his uniform every day, continued stopping his car, continued speaking to people in his familiar calm voice. But one thing had changed. Every time he stepped out of his car for a night shift, he knew that somewhere, a camera was recording, not to protect him from others, but to protect the truth from being distorted. One late afternoon, Darnell drove past the very same street where he had been handcuffed. The streetlights were still a pale yellow, just like that night. He stopped at a red light and looked out at the empty sidewalk. No patrol cars, no crowds, just an ordinary street corner. The light turned green, and he drove away without looking back. This story doesn't end with a winner or a loser. It ends with a redivided line. The line between law enforcement and abuse of power, between emotion and procedure, between prejudice and truth. And if there's one lesson left after all this, it's this: true power doesn't lie in badges or guns, but in the ability to be verified. When the cameras are on, when witnesses don't turn away, when someone dares to say, "Record it," then even the smallest mistakes cannot escape scrutiny. If you believe that justice needs light to exist, please share this story, not to condemn, but to remind each other that the truth is only valuable when it is faced head-on. And sometimes, all it takes to change a system is a camera that stays on and someone calm enough to stand still in its presence.